When I've given lectures before, the number one question, I've been doing this for almost a year already, because my book came out in 2011, the number one question that people have asked me is, how is it that you came to write a book about Jacobsons? And so my intent here is to talk about Jacobsons and not about me, so I'll get the me part out of the way, but because that's what people always ask me. I was not a Jacobsons employee, but I was a Jacobsons customer at one time. And I had a family that liked to travel, as Mike said. And when we would travel, because my mother liked to shop, we'd usually wind up in a downtown somewhere looking around, and we'd go in a department store, this or that. I still have memories of being 3 years old and being terrified at the wooden escalators in Macy's in New York when we went to New York in 1962. So we did that. So I was always very fascinated by these great big buildings that carried all this merchandise. For instance, the downtown Hudson's, one time I was old enough to wander away from my mother while she was shopping, and on the 10th floor there in the toy department, or 12th, I don't even remember what floor the toy department was in, but there was a room off on the side of the toy department that I walked into, and they had giant jars with things like locusts this big in formaldehyde that if you were interested in chemistry, you could cut that apart. Now that's something I don't think Macy's carries today at all. But these stores had everything in them, and they were fascinating. So as I got older and we traveled, I would always grab a newspaper, and it would have the logos of some very nice stores like Woodward and Lothrop in Washington, D.C., or I mentioned Macy's and Gimbel's in New York, or some of the other places that we have, Eaton's in Montreal, and places like that. So it was always something that I had a fascination for, and it grew a little bit to in the stage of my life where I was a wallflower, it grew to kind of a hobby. I wrote down things about what was on what floor and what stores and what they looked like on the outside, and saved them in a file. And this file is about the only thing I have that lasted from years before my college. So I had a knowledge of the subject. When I lost my job in 2000, people said, how did you think you came to write a book? I said, well, unemployment helped. Because I lost my job in 2009 as an architect, and I just tried to do anything I could. So I thought, there was nothing online on the internet really about these great stores. Here and there, a museum would have something, or a library would have a little page or something devoted to something, but it wasn't comprehensive. So I started putting all my information online. I searched for more in old newspaper archives and things like that. And I started this thing called the Department Store Museum. So a publisher contacted me, saw that, and said, we want to write a book about a Michigan department store, and we're thinking Jacobson's, can you do it? And I said, well, 40,000 words about Jacobson's, that would be awfully hard to do, because to me it was just a department store in our community. But what I uncovered was a fascinating story, and one that's well worth reading about, talking about. And this is a fairly small crowd, but I've had some very, very large crowds in many cities, that people that just almost can't get enough because they miss Jacobson's. Now the title of the book came about, there's a lady that lives in Grosse Pointe here, Lois Trost, and she was the manager of the toy department in the Grosse Pointe store. She started working there in 1970. And she was one of the first people I talked to about Jacobson's, and she said, going to work every day at Jacobson's was like going to a party with my friends. And she said, now that it's gone, I miss it so. So the title of my book, I said it has to be Jacobson's, I Miss It So. Of course, the publisher hated the title, fought me on it, but I've even heard about 6 or 7 people here today already say, I miss Jacobson's so, I really miss it. So that's a sentiment that everybody has about the store. But anyway, I came to know Jacobson's because my sister moved to Ann Arbor. And one day I was there, and I came along when she took my mom downtown, and they had a Jacobson's there. And my mom really liked it. She was a bargain shopper, but she found things on clearance racks, and she was treated really well there, and liked it enough to say, where do they have one of those close to where we live? And we live near city airports, so we would come down to Grosse Pointe to shop. And my mom at the time, my dad had lost his job during the energy crisis of the 70s, and my mom had to go to work, and she went to work in a factory midnights of all things. But when my dad was able to retain some employment, he told her, well, you can quit now. You can stay home and cook the meals and stuff. And she pulled her big wad out of her purse so that she had money from working and being paid pretty well for working in the factory, and said, I'm not quitting because I like this too much. So she became a pretty dedicated Jacobson shopper. And around that time, I learned how to drive, so I needed to get my driving permit and all that. And it was, my dad would want to stay home and watch a football game, and she'd say, Bruce, get in the car. We're going to Jacobson's. You can get some driving practice and all that. So it was kind of a chance relationship that I had with Jacobson's, but I saw very much that it was a very different store from your typical big department stores, that there was certainly a personal character to it. It had class, it had its own style that was very, very different. And so when I was given the commission to write the book, I said, there's got to be something interesting here, and boy, what a story I found. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And the Jacobsons actually lasted in Michigan for 134 years. Which makes it a very old institution and something that was very, very familiar to many people. the whole issue of the department store and why it's important. Why would a publisher want to put out a book about Jacobson's? Why is it important? Well, that department store itself was an important part of family life in most communities. People will remember. People remember those silver boxes with the bows on them under their trees at Christmas time. They remember that they bought. So many people said, "Oh, I got my wedding gown, or I got my communion dress at Jacobson's," and this all wove into our culture. I'd like to travel to Europe. So when you go to Europe, you want to see culture. You go to a museum, you go to a castle, a palace, something like that. Our American culture is a little bit different. It's much, much younger, and it's a commercial culture. So rock and roll music is considered a cultural icon of America because it's something that developed here. And the department store, actually, even though there were department stores in Europe, the American department store, because of the great growth it had, many times just small family-owned shops that became these colossal institutions like Hudson's in downtown Detroit or Macy's in New York, really became a part of their local lore. And so many of the stores had restaurants that were named after physical features of the area. The downtown Detroit, Hudson's had a restaurant called the Riverview Room because you could see the river from the top floor there and all that. So they built on their own local area. They were generally locally owned. They formed into chains as years went by, but it's undeniable the role that they played in our communities. And now Jacobson's was, where did he go?
There we go. Okay, good.
Jacobson's was located here in Michigan. And their headquarters was in Jackson. They were founded in Reed City. But the interesting thing about that is that all the wealth of knowledge, of ability to run a store, the architects who worked for the company that designed the stores and designed the interiors, was all, we're having an epic
Projector problem.
equipment fail.
There we go.
That took me out. That has anything to do with that. I'm not touching that until I have to switch the slide. All these things resided right in Michigan. That when you had accountants and all these well-paying jobs and a store that was profitable, making money, located right in Michigan. It wasn't headquartered in Cincinnati like Macy's is or Bentonville, Arkansas like Walmart is. All these things added wealth and richness to our communities. And without that really in the community, all you have is people who are able to run cash registers and not so much of the knowledge and the wealth and the bonus that gives really to a growing economy. So I think that was a big part of the state's history. Now, there was a man named Nathan Rosenfeld. Interestingly enough, Jacobson's was only owned by the Jacobson family from 1868 to 1939. And it was primarily just a woman's dress shop at the time. Nathan Rosenfeld bought the store and made it into what it was. And he's a very interesting character because he was certainly one of the most principled business people that I've ever read about. And he operated the store. He had ideas really bursting from his head and operated the store in such a way that it was able to grow pretty dramatically in the time he ran it. And my personal belief is that Nathan Rosenfeld, if you go to Chicago, outside the Merchandise Mart, there's something called the National Retail Hall of Fame, and there are all these busts on pylons along the Chicago River. So Marshall Field is there, Montgomery Ward is there, R.H. Macy probably, all these names that people would be familiar with in retailing. There's no Nathan Rosenfeld, but he sure belongs there, in my opinion, because he really did something remarkable with the store. And then I think I touched on already that everybody just liked Jacobson's. They treated people well. Lois Trost, the woman that I mentioned, she said, when I retired, Jacobson's didn't really owe me a thing. I owed them. My relationship with Jacobson's helped me keep my husband healthy because she had to go to work because her husband was sick. And she said, I retired quite comfortably off of what I did. And she said, I really owed them when it was all done. And the sentiment was among customers and employees. Just for a show of hands, how many people here are actually happy that there isn't any Jacobson's in Grosse Pointe anymore? Nobody. How many people are happy that there's no Jacobson's at all? Nobody. See, I mean, it's pretty universal. I've never had anybody raise their hand at those questions. Now, just the basic history of Jacobson's. There was an immigrant from Eastern Europe called Abraham Jacobson, wound up in Reed City because that was the center of the lumbering industry, and opened a store. He was a Jewish immigrant. He had a shopkeeper, so he opened the original Jacobson store, and that's the interior of it. And there's a picture in the book on the windows on the outside. And it's an ancient picture that was kind of hard to do any restoration to, but on the glass on the outside, the store said Jacobson's Fancy Goods. And the
maybe you should stand there and hit it for the PC.
I don't think it's really.
You don't think it's
this
PC?
I think that the projector is it's losing a signal somehow. Well, I'm just going to talk, and maybe it'll...
It'll change its mind in a minute. Let me see what I can do while you're talking. I brought our projector, we should have it up.
Well, I have my own too. There's a function F7 that you can sometimes hit to get it to, but it should be set really.
It should say.
Function button is.
You need light?
Yeah, why don't you hit the light for a second? There we go.
Oh.
Cancel button.
If you start with this program, there.
Tell you what, I'll sit here. Happens again, I'll hit F7. Excuse
The
us.
function button is
Sorry.
The control button is missing. The function is the little blue one next to it.
Okay, good.
But as I was saying, on the windows outside of the store, it said Jacobson's Fancy Goods. And the whole thought behind his business was this: Reed City was a small but growing lumber town. And he thought, if I sold the same things that were available on Fifth Avenue in New York, people in Reed City would buy them, because everybody likes quality, everybody likes good things. So the store had a reputation for selling fine merchandise, really almost from the start. Now he had 3 sons, Moses, William, and Benjamin, in that order. Moses was the oldest. Moses' job was a trunk salesman for the company. He would take a dozen trunks of merchandise from Jacobson's and travel around Michigan and rent a room in a hotel and advertise in the newspaper that he had Jacobson merchandise to sell. Now what that tells me is that the Jacobson name, even in the mid to late 1800s, had a reputation. People couldn't get to Reed City very easily at that point. You would never think of driving. We could be at Reed City in 3 hours probably in a car. In that day, those days you couldn't do it. So even if there was this great shopping destination, people wouldn't consider that. But they decided to take the merchandise to where the people were, which was sort of a step in the direction toward Jacobson's ultimate history as a big department store. Moses traveled around the state of Michigan with these trunks, and he would sell merchandise then to people. So he would spread the reputation. But what he found out when he would travel is that the growth in Michigan was not going to be up in Reed City. The lumber business was dying out, the forests were being exploited, but there was great growth along the line from Detroit to Ann Arbor, Jackson, Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, into Chicago, which was one of the main railway lines at the time, eventually I-94, and then another line from Detroit to Lansing up to Grand Rapids. And so after his father passed away in the late 1800s, Moses decided that he was going to move to Jackson. And he purchased a business in Jackson that was known as the Faulkner Porter Company, which was a pretty well reputed ladies store. And this happened in 1904, that he moved the business down. His very youngest brother, Benjamin, stayed in Reed City and operated the other Jacobson store there as a side business. The two were not really related, but Benjamin kept running that store. And this store in Jackson became known as the M.I. Jacobson Company. And that was the original really growth move that Jacobson's took at that point in time. Now, Moses was, I should add that the Jacobson family had an issue at that point in time, which was heart disease, which really they didn't have the medical technology either. So Abraham died of a heart attack somewhat prematurely. Moses suffered from heart disease, and you'll see a little bit how this affliction affected the story of Jacobson's and what happened to it ultimately. But Moses moved down there, and he really established the store and had a very good reputation as a great businessman, as a good person to have in the community. And he was able to expand the store. In 1919, they built a whole new store on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Mechanic Street in Jackson. And he named you can't see it in that little illustration that came from the newspaper, but there was an inscription on top of the building. It said the Esther Jacobson Building. So he named the building after his mother, for whom he had a lot of respect. And he was able to expand into Ann Arbor and Battle Creek as well with his business. Now, Moses died of a heart attack in 1929. And at the time he was eulogized, and it was somewhat interesting. I guess today you would call it completely politically incorrect, but in the newspaper there, it was hinted at that the city really respected him, that he was a great businessman to have. And I think there were some comments in there almost about his Jewish faith that were, well, this isn't at all as negative as what we'd heard, because Jackson was kind of it was a growing industrial city. It was kind of unusual to see something like that in the newspaper, but what stands out more than that, I think, is just the very fact that that he was so very well respected. Now, there's some funny stories about Moses that he was a great businessman. He was a social butterfly. He built his ladies' business up by knowing when there were going to be balls, cotillions, things like that, and he would call up the society ladies in Jackson and say, well, you know, if this big party's coming up, you've got to have a dress from Paris, and I just got to stock in, so you've got to get in here. And his landlord recounted a story where the landlord's daughter was going away to finishing school. And she was probably 14 or something like that, and they were going to send her away to this finishing school, and Moses showed her a beautiful girl's fur coat and said, no self-respecting girl would go to finishing school without a fur coat, so you just have to have this. She tried it on, he told her how good she looked, and when the landlord came to pick her up, and of course, she was sold already. He had to buy the coat and everything. So after Moses died, the landlord said, well, you know, Moses was such a good businessman, he always knew how to get my rent money back. And that was a good example of how he did it. Now, around the same time, you know, this was, you know, Moses passed away in 1929. His brother William took over the store, and William also suffered from heart disease. This fellow, Nathan Rosenfeld, who was born in 1901, he was a very bright young man, got scholarships to go to college at the time. His family had a retail business, but a small one, and he went to, he got a scholarship to the Philadelphia College of Art, but then went to Wharton Business School, which is one of the most prestigious business schools in all the United States. And he was friends with Stanley Marcus, who his family owned Neiman Marcus, and he actually made Neiman Marcus into what it was in the 20th century by his talent. There was another fellow by the name of Sidney Solomon, whose family owned this huge department store in Brooklyn named Abraham and Strauss. So he hung around with these retailers who all had family businesses that they could get an education and go into. He didn't really have that, but he had all these ideas about how he would like to see a retail store run. So he got jobs in retailing, and the early 1930s found him working in Washington, D.C. at a large store called the Hecht Company. And this Hecht Company was a very, very big, colossal, multi-floor department store in downtown Washington, and he was one of the managers there. And already he tried to put his ideas to use. And anybody that's worked in a big organization sometimes knows that you can have all kind of ideas, but they get shot down. Everybody will poke away at the ideas until there's almost nothing left. And Nathan really found that to be a problem. So he had an idea one day that at this Hecht Company, they had a staff of floor walkers on the first floor, which you don't hear that term too much in the department store, floor walker. In fact, the first time my mother said something, we were in the store, and she said, we're being followed by a floor walker. And I'm like, floor walker? Was it like an in-store street walker? Or what? Who were these people that were following us? But what it was like a customer service agent, a manager that would walk around the floor and assist customers if they had problems. And they usually wore a carnation or something like that. And the floor walkers at the Hecht Company all had to sign every charge sale, had to be signed by a floor walker. Well, because this was such a large store, the sales were rung up almost constantly, and these floor walkers would just take and sign it without even looking at it. Everything just got signed, don't bother me, leave me, I'm busy, oh here, you need a signature, sign it, and on. And Nathan thought this was a waste of time. He said, we have a credit staff that should be approving customers, and we shouldn't have to have somebody sign this and approve it right on the spot every time. So he went to the management with his plan to have that stopped, and they said, oh no, this is how we do it at the Hecht Company. We're not changing, we're not stopping. So he was very discouraged, because here was one of his good ideas, and nobody wanted to listen to it. So he had another idea. He said, well, how can I get people to see my point of view? So there were maybe 15 floor walkers on the floor, so he had 15 resignation letters typed up by a secretary. And then he went to the salespeople and said, would you have Mr. So-and-so sign this? And they signed it without even knowing. So then he took all the letters back to a board meeting and said, I've just gotten all the resignations of all the floor walkers, because they signed these things without even knowing what they were. And that the management then said, okay, we will implement your plan to stop having them sign all the products. So he had a knack for showing people things that they maybe couldn't see for themselves, a way to show it a little bit. Also, I have a picture up there of his wife, Marjorie, whom he met at the time. She apparently heard about him and crashed a wedding he was attending in Washington just to meet him. And they fell in love and were married very shortly after, and their marriage lasted until Nathan died in 1982. And from reading the history, she actually chronicled a lot of the history of Jacobson's in her own notes, which still exist. And what I came to realize is they had a marriage that was a partnership, but they also were business partners, that she very much supported him with all of his ideas, all of his endeavors, and was right there after him. Jacobson's employees would tell me that Nathan's personality was somewhat mercurial, and he could ruffle feathers very easily. He'd come into a store and say, I don't like that display, get that down. I don't like the signs here, take it down, and ruffle everybody's feathers. But they said Marjorie would be right behind him with a notebook, writing down everything he said to make sure that the ideas that he had were implemented. And apparently she even went so far as to insist that her recipe and her recipe alone for tuna casserole be served at every board meeting that Jacobson's had. So she was pretty strong. Her son even told me that she was pretty strong-willed, so they were a good match in that respect. They're both strong-willed, but she certainly was a great business partner for him. Nathan pondered a lot about the idea of how stockrooms should be used. And if you remember Jacobson's, you know that they didn't have a lot of merchandise on the floor like stores do today, where it's crammed in and you can't even get between the racks, or if you want to pull something off a rack, sometimes you got to get something off. Jacobson's was very, very genteel in the way it presented the merchandise. And what they tried to do is present some variety of merchandise, but keep all the extra sizes in the back. And that's something you very seldom get in the store. When somebody said, let me look in the back and see what I can do. Jacobson's, they could always look in the back and bring something out for you. That was really kind of their hallmark. Well, their stockrooms were designed in such a way that they could be very efficiently used. Nathan coined a term called conveniating the stockrooms. He wanted the merchandise that was going to go in and out closer to the door, to the sales floor, and the stuff that was more dead storage toward the back. And it was more complicated than that, but that was the general idea. So Marjorie took his idea and she wrote all the stockroom utilization and working manuals for the company. And she put that together based on understanding his idea. So it shows, really, and they, like I said, they had a marriage, but it was a lot more than that in terms of their ability to work together. So these friends of his, like Stanley Marcus, they had company businesses to go to. And Nathan seemed to hit that wall all the time with management that didn't really buy into his ideas. So he started looking for a business. He and his brother Zola, who was working in St. Paul, Minnesota, a large department store, started a search. And I say the history of Jacobson's is sort of like a crossroads where Nathan Rosenfeld's path was going this way and the Jacobson's family's path was going that way. And right at Jackson, the two met. When Nathan found out that Jacobson's was for sale, his parents came, or Marjorie's parents came to Cincinnati where he was living at the time, working for another store, and watched their kids while Marjorie and Nathan drove up to Jackson. And it was in the fall of 1939, and they were amazed at the beautiful color up in Michigan at the time, and decided that really Jacobson's was the thing to buy. Now Zola objected and said, I thought we were going to buy a department store. We're looking to run a department store, and this is really just a woman's shop. And Nathan said, you know, if we bought a department store, it would have all the problems that were built into it for all these years. Jacobson's is small, we can build it into a department store, and everything's going to be fresh the way we want it. So Zola agreed, and he went into business with his brother, and they did buy Jacobson's, and moved to Jackson and started the growth process there. Now, Jacobson's was a business that Nathan built on principles. Like I said, he was a man whose head was full of ideas. So some of his principles were something like, a business is like a cathedral, it should never be finished. So if I were to show you, and I will show you, pictures of the Grosse Pointe store from where it started as the original Tuttle and Clark decorating shop, to the 1950s when it had a very modern facade, to the 1970s when it was remodeled in a Williamsburg style, he kept on improving the store so that they always looked fresh, they always looked elegant, they were always timely. And every one of the Jacobson stores started off looking like one thing and ended up looking like another for the most part. Because actually the reason that he did that was that he took his business depreciation, and rather than adding that, the depreciation that he had on the physical plant, rather than adding that to the bottom line of profit, he reinvested it always. He said that depreciation is not an accounting fiction, but a reality. That if you don't take that money that you get for depreciation and reinvest it, it's just not going to do your business any good. This cable doesn't come loose. Something like that. There's all the functions are good. It refreshes the screen. I don't know if I've ever had this happen. There we go. Okay. So, and I was just thinking to myself how nice it was that it wasn't doing that. Again, well, we're a little bit cut off. But anyway, getting back to the whole issue of the principles, the other one thing that he said, there's no customer who is more important to us than our employees. I'm sorry, there's no... I'm missing one here. If we don't look after the needs of the customer, who will? Nathan saw his business as an advocate for customers. A man named Jim Delaney, who I met, was the head of personnel for Jacobson's for a lot of years. And he told me a story. He said, because I worked at Jacobson's, I bought all my wife's clothing because I saw what was new, and then I saw what I thought she would like, and I'd bring it home. And he said, one time I bought her a beautiful Adolfo suit. And we had to go to New York on a business trip, and here we were in Saks, and there was the same Adolfo suit on the mannequin. I said, oh, look, dear, there's your suit. And we went up to look at it, and she said, but it isn't. The buttons aren't sewn on as well. There's only 3 threads holding this one on, whereas mine's got about a dozen. And mine's got a silk lining. And he said, well, that's because it's from Jacobson's, because our buyers understand our customers so well that we know that people can't stand buttons that pop off. And then we know that women don't care for wool without a lining because it's scratchy and it doesn't feel comfortable. So we know we wouldn't sell it any other way. So we told the manufacturer, if you can't do this and can't do that, we won't sell your merchandise. So obviously, Saks Fifth Avenue, being a much bigger organization, didn't care. They would just take the merchandise from the manufacturer the way it came and sell it that way. But Jacobson's really looked after, and for all the time I've been talking with people about Jacobson's over the last couple of years, we talk about customer service and how important that was. And I decided a few weeks ago that it wasn't really customer service, it was personal service. Because the salespeople knew the employees and knew the customers in a very intimate way, which is different from going to Walmart, and shopping. On the other hand, he also said there's no customer who is more important to us than our employees. So he wanted to create an organization that treated the employees well, both in terms of how they were paid and how they were treated. So one interesting thing, some of the people may remember that in the 1950s and 1960s, Jacobson's was closed on Saturdays in the summer. They had summer closings. The sole reason for doing that was to give the employees weekends with their families. And they sat down and asked the employees before they did this, do you think you can sell as much in 5 days as you can in 6? And the employees said, well, yeah, give us a try. And they implemented this policy that everybody would have a whole weekend off, and they actually had a sales increase. The employees were happy enough with the fact that somebody cared about their family life that they worked harder during the time that they had to be at work there during the week. And he said the great idea is to take something small that is worthwhile and build it up by working hard at it. And that's the history of Jacobson's in a nutshell. A little dress shop becomes the biggest privately owned specialty department store in the United States. And then this one I think is really telling. If you only sell things that people can pick off the shelf and satisfy the demand created by the manufacturer, before long, retailers become nothing more than vending machines with checkout counters. Couldn't that be a definition of a Walmart? Wouldn't it? So it was a whole different atmosphere in terms of shopkeeping. And I'm just dare to get this.
Try it again, yeah.
Because I don't have a full screen there, and I don't know quite why.
Well, you're right.
Yeah, this isn't works. Oh, pretty much I do.
I'm so sorry.
Here, if I was doing it real good.
Great.
If it comes back up. So, like I said, it was really personal service that they worked on, and it was very intimate. Now, one of the things that the store was, let me make sure we didn't miss anything in that. The store became a part of the community where it was located. I don't think anybody that lived in Grosse Pointe and experienced that store here thought that it was just a branch of a large chain that was located in Jackson. They saw Jacobson's as a Grosse Pointe store. People in Birmingham saw the Jacobson's there as a Birmingham store. If you lived in Grosse Pointe, it became part of, Grand Rapids, it became part of that community as well. The first lecture I gave was in Birmingham, and I went through that litany of these stores and what people thought about. One guy raised his hand, he said, no, it was a Dearborn store. He was from Dearborn, and he felt that way about, I didn't mention Dearborn, so he felt that way about his. Now, the way they did that was, when they came into a community, they did things like have the manager get on the city council or city planning commission, get involved, get on the boards of libraries, hospitals, things like that. And also, for instance, if you had a charge account with Jacobson's, your bill came right from the store that you shopped at in your community, rather than from some invisible headquarters somewhere. And again, I mentioned the issue of how he said that depreciation is a physical fact. and not an accounting fiction. That was the original, the top picture there was the original Jacobson store on Kirchable when it opened in 1944. And it was known as the Tuttle and Clark Decorating Shop. Before too long, they built a home decorating store across the street.
Which was Borders later on.
Yeah, and until that bit the dust.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. Somebody lost this
It
one.
seems like Jacobson's, this was all individual stores at one time. Oh, wow. Yeah, and that's why they didn't want to make it a hotel or anything, because it was so
If you'll just excuse me for that, I'm just going to give this another shot at, because I got some kind of a issue here. This is the first time I've had this. So.
My son did too. In the shoe department, children's shoe department.
It was upstairs, you went to that elevator and it was up.
Usually if you just
Yeah.
get the,
She started out with Miss J. Oh, yeah, sure. And then she was and I'm still. It's where she, her grade She was what? Oh, sure.
now, if this was Halloween, I'd say it was normal in our province, but it's not. Careful, there's no, it's the next one, this one's escape.
This is a detriment.
Yeah, no.
That's the first one.
I wonder if it would be.
Hard to find that is good.
Is that how it's right outside, you know.
Okay, good. All right.
I mean,
We have our projector too. It should-
Okay, well, I'm going to keep on talking, and then we'll maybe get this
Yeah,
come
we'll
back.
get
So,
speed.
anyway, then by the time that, that original store seemed a little bit dated, they kept on adding until they got, filled out the whole block. And in the 1950s, it looked like a very, very modern store with sort of an aluminum and brick facade on it. But in the 70s, it was reinvested. They reinvested money in it again to make it look like it was a transplant from Williamsburg. They kind of fit the colonial style that the Grosse Pointes were striving to have there. And one of his principles that he had was that Jacobson's was the best thing that a store could have was its own physical plant, and that he was worth investing that money in to make those stores always have that kind of Jacobson's look that they did. So what he did when he took control of Jacobson's was to strive to build it into a department store from a dress shop. So he was the type of person that was able to draw talented people to himself. So he hired buyers, for instance. He hired a buyer in Battle Creek. It was a couple, actually, that had experience with children's wear, and had them develop then the idea that Jacobson's could carry a line of children's wear. And in Jackson, where their main store was at the time, they were able to add on based on more product lines. So they would purchase the building next door and add on, and bang a hole through the wall, and build some ramps and things like that so they could make the store bigger. And eventually, not long after that, they added menswear, home decorative shops. So in Grosse Pointe, in the 1950s, they added that home decorative shop across the street to add to their merchandise offering. And by the time that rolled around, they were more of a specialty shop with a variety of different categories. I mentioned that there was a store in Dearborn, and a few doors down from the store in Dearborn.
Take it off?
It just seems, yeah, it seems to go off. I've got it right now where actually I can take the slides, but I know that function F7 is the one that would usually get it to connect.
And it did.
Oh, the projector is okay, it's just, we're not getting the signal. If you could put that on just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Just the back, the front
Yeah,
one.
it says no signal.
That's technically something like that. definitely on, it is working, like, advanced. Can you turn that off just for a second?
Sure.
Certainly advance this.
And it does come back.
We're getting no signal.
Yep.
Let's see, let's just see one come back on.
Well, no, I mean, I can, this part of it is working, but I can't hear it too.
Are we just not, maybe we have, source has PC. That's correct. Have you had this, like, projecting on the screen?
It was, yeah, it was working,
yeah.
it just,
There goes the no signal.
I got it to,
There it
Oh,
goes.
something's going on.
There we go.
okay, so we're back, but now we're not.
I think, is
This
your
is
laptop like
happening
falling
now 3 or 4
asleep
times.
while we're doing this, maybe?
I don't believe so, I mean, it doesn't do that normally.
I mean, I
Let's see,
don't
I
know.
think because I gave it a resetting here.
Yeah, I think it's something with your laptop. The projector is okay. It's just not, sometimes the laptop is doing, maybe going to sleep. You have it on when you go to sleep?
No, I don't know, maybe.
Um,
I'm just surprised that it,
Well, you have
when I had it running before, I thought we were okay to have the whole screen and everything. It seems
Why
easier
about
to,
you?
It's definitely hooked up to the projector properly, and we have the projector on the right channel to run.
There we go.
It's something to do with your laptop and not our equipment, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Sorry.
well, I'll just keep on going until we lose it again. I apologize.
No, there's not much I can do. I'm sorry, guys.
No problem. I appreciate you coming down, though. Okay.
So in Dearborn, there was a well-known furniture business a few doors down from Jacobson's. And Nathan got to know, through that community thing again, got to know the owners of the furniture business. It was called Daly Brothers, and they had a store in Dearborn, one in Bloomfield Hills. So he purchased Daly Brothers and also an interior design shop in Ann Arbor called Martin Haller Interiors, and then was able to incorporate that furniture department into the store. So that by 1969 or so, really Jacobson's was a full-fledged department store with home furnishings, clothing, and a variety of other things like that. And so that was the vertical expansion that he had in mind, was turning the ladies' shop into a full department store. But then there was also, at the same time, horizontal expansion. That right after he took control of Jacobson's in 1939, I should pause here to tell kind of an interesting story. I didn't like to tell this story because it's one of the anecdotes in the book, and my wife said, you got to tell this story. And I said, well, I don't want to give everything away. I mean, people, they're going to read the book and say, well, he talked about all the good parts in the book and left the rest out. So, but she was right that it needs to be told. So when Nathan took control of Jacobson's in 1939, the papers were signed with the Jacobson family on Friday night. And when the Jacobsons were done, because of the heart disease and all this, now, the story behind when William Jacobson was running the store, he had the heart disease. He called his son back from law school to run the family business. And his son's heart was not in retailing, but he was a dutiful son. So he did what his dad asked him. He left college, and he came back to run the store. But as his father got sick, or his father had to go to a sanatorium to live, he decided that, I think we got to sell this place. I can't do this. I want to be an attorney. I don't want to be a retailer. So he put the business up for sale with his father's blessing. And when Nathan showed up and decided to buy the store, got the financing, the deal went through on a Friday night, they signed the papers, the Jacobson family took off. They just wanted to go on vacation, get out, not have all this pressure on them from the business aspect of it. So they were gone. And this was 1939, so there was no cell phones, there wasn't any way to reach them. They went, and nobody even knew where they went on vacation. They maybe went up north, but nobody knew. So Nathan came into work, and the lady's name was Mrs. Price, that was running the office manager in the office of the store. And she said, oh, there we go again. So she said, he noticed that in the papers all week long that they were advertising a big fur sale they were going to have. And he said, well, Mrs. Price, I guess we have to get the furs out of the fur vault so we can sell them. And she said, oh, there's a problem. She said, because what I know is that those are all under combination lock, and the only person with the combination is Mr. Jacobson. And he said, so how are we going to sell the furs? And she said, I can't help you. I didn't even know where they went. So Nathan sat down for a minute, and he said, well, how can I solve this? And he decided to call the warden of Jackson Prison, because he'd met him at a Rotary meeting. And he said, do you have someone that can help me out here? So 45 minutes later, 2 guards show up at the store with a criminal in handcuffs, and the guy cracked the safe, and Nathan bought him lunch, or breakfast, or whatever it was at that point in time, and the first sale was a big success. So it shows you really how he was able to use his problem solving. And one of the things one of the principles he really hated the idea of using an outside consultant for the store. And something that he thought was ridiculous, that somebody could come and tell him how to run his business. They don't even know the business. They're not really involved in it. And so what he said though was, I did use a consultant one time, and that was the safecracker. He said, because I had to go where there was real talent. Yeah, I didn't have the talent. I didn't have the talent that he had to run the store.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you know, I don't necessarily agree with Pete that because I haven't had this happen except with setup or something. Maybe it's a combination of the two.
Got that same thing that could just come up.
See, what you want is that little thing here, VGA.
So sorry.
Yeah, I really watched that one. You know, this one, now it's going to come up. Well, we've got a routine anyway. So that was the vertical growth that they would add department stores. The horizontal growth was going across Michigan. Not long after Nathan took control of the store, he heard of a dress shop in East Lansing that was for sale. Thought I could expand my business to there. And as he went up there and looked at the store with his wife, and he wasn't real happy with the conditions there or with the store's sales and things. And she said, "Why would you buy somebody else's store when you could just do your own? Just look for property there." So they opened up their own store in East Lansing. It was very successful, and again, it was added to over the years. And the growth continued on. They went to Saginaw, built a store in 1944. They expanded to Grand Rapids in 1943. If anybody's familiar with the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel, the first two floors of I believe it would be like the north side of that building where the Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is now was a Jacobson store at one time. And what happened there was that the United States Army had this was during the war, and they had a weather training school. And they moved out, and a friend of Nathan's called him and said, "You know, you really ought to consider this space because it's right in the downtown shopping area." The only problem was that during the war there weren't any building materials available. There was rationing, there was shortages and things like that because of the war effort. So what they did was they used curtains in the store to separate the stock rooms and all that, and they hired an art school to paint the curtains to match the wall coverings and things like that. So they got a lot of great publicity by using these kids from the art school to use their talent to design the store. So again, it was a problem-solving sort of thing that Jacobson's faced. Now in 1944, Jacobson's made a big move. The Detroit area was so dominated by the J.L. Hudson Company, and it was almost like a David and Goliath type of affair. When Jacobson's came in, small store from Jackson is going to come and try to take some sales away from the J.L. Hudson Company, which really dominated the high fashion market with its offerings and things like that. Well, what Nathan thought was, I'm not going to build a store downtown, just like Hudson's has, because it would be too hard to compete with them right now. But if I put my stores in the neighborhoods where the customers come from and where I know my customers live, I can offer them the chance to shop right in their own community rather than having to take a bus downtown. I can save them time. I can give them that personalized service that the big store doesn't have. So the first of these really was the Jacobson store on Birchable. Now this picture was taken probably in the late 40s or early 50s. And you can see that the original Tuttle and Clark building right here, but they had already moved down towards St. Clair Avenue with a two-story addition to it. So the store was beginning to grow by that time. And then with the success of that, he ringed Detroit with stores in 1950 in Birmingham, and then there was 1964 in Dearborn the same way. So he had stores all the way around the city of Detroit, but in the neighborhoods where the Jacobson customer shop. Now, I mentioned the somewhat ramshackle nature of their store in Jackson. In 1961, that was replaced as well with a completely modern new store. And East Grand Rapids got a store in 1966. And so the company really covered all of Michigan by that time. Now, there's a quote that was quite well known among the people that worked for Jacobson's, and it was when 1969, Nathan took his family on a cruise, on a vacation. And they went down to Florida, and they stayed and visited some friends first before they went on the cruise, and the friends lived in Sarasota. And the weather was kind of bad the day they were down there, and he was sitting in traffic, and the windshield wipers were back and forth. And he's looking, or Margie was at the wheel, she was actually driving, he was looking and said, look at all the Michigan license plates down here in Florida. And I wonder how many of these people have Jacobson's credit cards. And if they do, why don't we give them somewhere to shop? So he immediately, after they got back from their cruise, he went shopping for a store. He found a store in Florida, in Sarasota, that was called the Yankee Traveler. And what impressed him about that was that it seemed like the customers that they were serving in Florida and right there in Sarasota were very much the Jacobson customer. So he bought the Yankee Traveler. It was a store that was owned by a couple. It offered mainly furniture, but it also had some women's fashions as well. And the unique thing about that was that upstairs was a complete apartment where the couple that owned it lived. But during the day when they would go down to run the store, the velvet rope that roped off the stairway would be pulled away, and their apartment became a furniture showroom. So they continuously moved the furniture around and used their own apartment as a furniture setting for the store. But the Yankee Traveler became really the first of a whole Jacobson's chain in Florida as well. And in 1972, they bought a store in Winter Park called the Proctor Shop. And these things were known as Jacobson's Yankee Traveler and Jacobson's Proctor Shop for a while, but eventually they just became Jacobson's. And people that I know, in particular here in Grosse Pointe, some friends of mine that have a place in Florida say, oh, well, we just really always enjoyed shopping at Jacobson's in Florida. It was the same, but it was different. And the reason it was the same was obviously it was run on the same principles and had the same type of atmosphere that the Jacobson's here did. But what Jacobson's did in Florida was that they had their own distribution center and buyers for Florida. So that way they were able to get to know those Florida customers and the snowbirds that came from Michigan every bit as well as they did up north. And their competitors like Saks Fifth Avenue, Bonwit Teller, and even Marcus, who had stores in Florida, all they did was send merchandise down from their main stores in New York or Dallas that they thought people in Florida would buy. And if they bought them, fine. If not, they sent them back up north and tried to sell them there. Whereas Jacobson's had their own distribution network. So some of the merchandise was very similar to what was in Michigan. Other things were specifically tailored to the Florida market. Obviously, you wouldn't sell as many fur coats in Florida as you would in Michigan. So, and by 1980, there were 8 Jacobson stores, and they eventually had about 14, I think, down in Florida.
I don't think we're going to fix the top cutoff.
Not that much, no. So Jacobson's, I talked about the store being a part of the community. And one of Nathan's principles was that, that he really saw the store as his business, but also as a device for improving the community that it was located in. So Jacobson's stores were almost always located in a downtown. He had an aversion to shopping malls because he thought it would be a horrible thing to have a Jacobson store located in the same building with a Spencer gift shop or a Fredericks of Hollywood or something like that. It just wouldn't be the class. They felt that if he advocated for what was in the downtown shopping district, it would be a much better atmosphere, much closer to the Jacobsons that the image that he saw as Jacobson. So, but he was willing to put his money where his mouth is and invest in those communities. One of the big stories here in Grosse Pointe in the early 1970s, when they remodeled and expanded the store, they had to provide better parking. So a parking deck was built behind the store, and the city was not crazy about a big concrete parking deck. But Nathan worked very, very hard with them to give that parking deck, even called it a carriage house instead of a parking deck. And he put architectural details on that were very similar to the ones on the store, and they even used an archway that was similar to the governor's stables in Williamsburg and things like that. And he eventually had the city council eating out of his hand because he was willing to invest money for this parking deck and make it an asset to the city rather than an eyesore. And that's the back of the store and the parking deck that existed there. You can see that it's got the pediment and things like that on it to try to disguise the fact that it was a parking deck. And Nathan, by and large, financed those things through becoming part of a tax district, and they improved the nature of the downtown shopping area as well. And this happened in Birmingham. I gave a lecture in Birmingham, and the ex-mayor was at the lecture, and he said, he stood up and raised his hand, he said, I want everybody to know how much that man really meant to the downtown shopping area in Birmingham, because he had so much to do with providing the parking and things like that. Even in Jackson, they lost their city bus service because the company that ran the buses, it was a private company, went out of business. So Nathan got together with other business owners and bought used school buses and operated a bus system for many years in Jackson until the city could take that over and have their own civic bus system. So they're very, very concerned about the well-being of the areas in which the stores are. And I often say that And when you had somebody like that, a powerful businessman who had money to spend, money to invest, as an advocate for your town, things were good. And now you don't really have that. You can go to some of these towns, and it's a little sad when you see what's become of their central business district. Now, also one of the innovations that Jacobson's had was in Jackson, that they moved their headquarters out of the store and into a distribution center that was so state-of-the-art at the time that even Macy's from New York and Sears and Roebuck came to see how Jacobson's was distributing merchandise throughout Michigan so well and out of this distribution center. And of course, their offices were there. And Nathan had several smaller principles that were applied to the business itself. Like his own office was left open during the day so that anybody could walk in and offer ideas, because he was stung by the times that he put forth ideas for an employer, and they didn't want to listen. So he always made sure that he listened. In fact, many ex-employees of Jacobson's headquarters told me, he said, you know what the greatest thing about working at Jacobson's was? They let me figure out what the solution to the problem could be. That we were given the ability to use our heads to try to solve problems that the company faced. And so he had this, and also that the conference table that they met at, the highest level of management they met at was round, so that there was no one person of authority sitting at the end of it that had to be pleased. They were all sort of on equal footing at the time. Now, another thing about Jacobson's was the humor that Nathan had. You can't see it there, unfortunately. It's in the book. When Nathan celebrated his 40th anniversary at Jacobson's in 1979, all the stores sent a handmade Christmas card that all the employees, a greeting card that all the employees signed to congratulate him on 40 years at Jacobson's. And one of the employees drew a sketch of it. It shows kind of the impish nature a little bit. Now, when I was researching the book, one of the former executives of Jacobson's said, don't idolize Nathan Rosenfeld. Don't put him up on a pedestal. He said, now, I'll tell you, I love the man. I worked for him. He was a great person to work for, but he could really be a pain in the neck. It was very difficult. He said he was firing people left and right. And the problem was that he would fire somebody, but then the next day come in and go, well, where's so-and-so? They said, well, you fired him yesterday. He said, well, I didn't mean that. I just got a little hot under the collar, So the firing actually got taken kind of lightly. In fact, I met one fellow that was a buyer, and he said, well, you know what happened to me? Here was the season where we would buy everything for Christmas. So it's the busiest time for me as a buyer, and I'm involved in something. Here comes Nathan picking a fight with me over something that I did. And we got into an argument, and he said, that's it, you're fired. And I said, I had all these papers on my desk, and I said, Nathan, I don't have time to be fired today. And Nathan left, and the guy just kept on working, and that's how that worked. So he had a little bit of a mercurial kind of personality, but he was really respected among people. And I know people, I've met people today that say, I live 2 doors down from him. And those were truly, Nathan and Marjorie were truly golden people. And actually, in the Jacobson family, one of the people, after I wrote the book, they got in contact with me and said, did you know that after my grandfather died, whenever my mother needed something, and the grandfather was the person that Nathan bought the store from, when my mother needed something for my father for school, Nathan paid for it. He was always checking up to make sure that I had everything, and she was widowed and kind of stuck at that point, and that they really took care of the guy after that. So, obviously had a heart of gold. But he had a real sense of humor, too, that there was a lot going on in the store that was kind of funny. And one of the best ones were the gag gifts, that he would come up with these ideas for gag gifts, and then they would actually produce them and sell them in the store as a gag. So they had these neckties that had in a diagonal pattern, it would say, YCDBSOYA in letters along the tie like this. And so it was supposed to be a conversation piece. When you met somebody, they would ask you, what does that, all those letters mean? And what it meant was, you can't do business while sitting on your assets. So that was what that was for. And they had, he also had, he couldn't stand buzzwords, so people would use the popular words of the day. And one of the ones at that time, and it was probably in the early 70s, was the bottom line. What's the bottom line? So he had cocktail glasses made that they could be sold in the gift department, and they had all these popular buzzwords printed all over them. At the very bottom was a bottom line. He said, well, now this bottom line I like, because when the drink goes down and hits the line, that means you get another one. So that's what that was about. But the best ones were that Nathan, because he was one of these old line businessmen, from the 50s, 40s, whatever. He had to wear a suit. Nobody could have a beard that worked for Jacobson's. He would make them shave it off right away. I've never seen it, but I get the impression it's kind of like the characters in that Mad Men TV show, that just this kind of very strict-minded businessman, and he thought the idea that a man would wear cologne was ridiculous. That you could not say, to chew people out for getting in the elevator with them with cologne on and all this. But Jacobson's made millions of dollars selling Aramis and all this other stuff. So it was a little bit of irony there. They made so much money, but he hated it. So what he came up with were these gag colognes, gag men's colognes. Like the ad here is for SC, and that meant Eau de Stale cigars. And he also came up with one that was Eau de Putting Green and Eau de Locker Room. But the best one was Manurique. That's the word manure in it. And if you say Manurique, that's what the cologne was. So they were always joking around. There was always a lot of joking around and good-natured humor in Jacobson's.
Bruce, we got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Jacobson's was also famous for its restaurants. And in Grosse Pointe, obviously. No, we got 10 minutes left.
Keep going. Keep talking.
So in Jacobson, in Grosse Pointe here, obviously the restaurant was on the first floor there, and it was called the St. Clair Room, and started off in the 50s as a cafeteria in the basement. And whenever the Jacobson, not all the Jacobson stores had restaurants, but when they did, it was also another social thing. And there's a picture of the St. Clair Room right there in its final form on the first floor there. That was a social destination as well. I have a niece that's a doctor, and she grew up in Ann Arbor, and she said, when she heard I was writing a book, she said, I can still remember going to magic shows. I can remember going to Breakfast with Santa and things like that her mother would take her to. And that's what helped make the store part of the community there, because they could use those rooms. And some of the recipes that were famous, the cheese soup, this garden sandwich. My wife works at Consumers Energy, and so Consumers Energy's headquarters was in Jackson. She has coworkers that used to have to go there for meetings. They said, we hated the meetings were boring, but we always knew we were going to go across the street to Jacobson's for lunch and have Hungarian mushroom soup, and it was that good that they remembered it so many years after. Now, my publisher asked me to come up with recipes for the book, and I'm thinking, where am I going to find recipes for this stuff? So one of the people that was helping me in Jackson said, well, there's a little home furnishing store, and there's a cafe behind it called Cafe Lila, and on Wednesdays they've got Jacobson's cheese soup. And it was a Wednesday, so I said, I'll go have my lunch, I'll go get this stuff. So I talked to the employee there, and I thought, well, maybe I could get the recipe for this to put in the book. And the owner of the place wasn't there, but I talked to the employee, and I said, is there any chance that they'd be willing? And she said, they will never let go of that recipe. There's no way they're letting go of that for a book. And I said, okay, whatever. But in the actual Jacobson's archives, I found recipes, so I was able to incorporate them in the book. The only problem was it was 5 gallons of cheese soup. So Carol and I had to do some mathematics and cut it down. And then we taste tested it all, and it all worked out. So that's where that was. Now, in 1982, in Jackson, they named October 7th Nathan Rosenfeld Day for all the contributions that Nathan made to the state of Michigan. He was responsible for the signs early on the expressway leading toward downtown, because he thought, well, if people are going to barrel by in the cars, they'll never know that there's a nice shopping district there. And he had somebody go up to Lansing and advocate for the state putting up signs like that to direct traffic to downtown. But a month or so later, after this celebration that they had honoring Nathan for all of his contributions, he passed away of cancer in December of 1982. And he was well enough, it was a very brief struggle, and he was well enough to be working in the store on Thanksgiving, but December 10th was the date that he passed away. He was really eulogized in the newspaper. People recounted all the great work that he did on behalf of Michigan cities, and in terms of building up this business in Michigan. But there was a lot of discussion of what's going to happen at Jacobson without Nathan Rosenthal, because he was a larger-than-life type of character. But he had a son that worked for the company, and his son was, Mark he had been in the service. He had worked at Jacobson's all his life. He started off as a student working in the summers, and then eventually went into the management training program there. And he took over along with this fellow, Russ Fowler, who was Nathan's right-hand man at the time. So he became chairman of the board, and Mark became president. So when that happened, it was felt that Jacobson's would have a smooth future with this kind of transition. But as time went on, there were things eating away at Jacobson's profitability. The economy in Michigan was very bad, and things were happening like the casual workplace. Jacobson's sold, my mother bought my high school graduation suit at Jacobson's. I still remember the beautiful wool, pearl gray colored suit, and the demand for that kind of merchandise was going down, because you had a casual workplace where people didn't buy those fine suits as often and things like that. The auto companies, if you remember in the 70s what happened to Chrysler, and there was all this uncertainty in Michigan. So Jacobson, and actually the Florida stores became more profitable than the Michigan stores. So it was the southern end of the operation was propping up the upper end. And Jacobson's, the management decided to try to counter that by opening stores in other communities. So they became a little bit more of a regional store with several stores in Ohio, one as far west as Kansas City, and some in Indiana and Kentucky as well. And those stores were generally successful, but the decay in Michigan, the decline of the downtowns. Now Jacobson's had a store in downtown Ann Arbor, and they had leased space in the stores to build a parking deck over the store. So what they did was they leased a 2-foot by 2-foot area that could be drilled through to put columns to build a parking deck. And Nathan said, "This is great, it's like leasing the holes in Swiss cheese." But he helped finance this parking deck. Well, as time went on, the city didn't take care of the parking deck, and the concrete was falling off. So Mark Rosenfeld told me, he said, people were coming in the store with chunks of concrete saying, "Hey, look, this almost fell on my car, or on my head." And there was a murder on one of the street corners there. So Jacobson's actually moved out of downtown Ann Arbor in 1993 because they got no cooperation from the city in terms of trying to clean the area up and get that do the required maintenance on the parking deck. So there were problems with the store and with some of its locations in that point. And by 1996, they had been running at a loss for 2 years. So the board of directors removed Mark Rosenfeld in 1996 and replaced him with a fellow named Gerald Mills, who had been the CEO of the J.L. Hudson Company. And he was the person that presided over in 1982 when Hudson's closed. So he was able to handle a declining business, for better or for worse. And the store actually returned to profitability to some degree. There was a lot of cost cutting, a lot of closings. They closed their store in Jackson, they closed the store in downtown Dearborn, and a number of things like that. They tried some new mall formats and tried to attract a younger customer. But even though they were able to cut costs enough to make a profit for 2 or 3 years, it really didn't have a long-lasting effect. So that by 2000, things were looking bad again for the store after Mills retired and was replaced. And actually what really did Jacobson's in was in 2001 when 9/11 hit. They were overstocked with high-end merchandise. And if everybody remembers what that was like when 9/11 happened, that nobody was really in a mood to buy diamond rings and designer gowns at that point. So they just couldn't pay the bills, and that was the end of that. Filed for bankruptcy in January, and by the fall that year, all the stores were liquidated. The idea was to be able to sell the stores, but it didn't really happen. A buyer didn't show up. But what I can say is, are there any former Jacobson's employees here? One there. Well, all the Jacobson's employees that I've met, you can't see the top of this slide, but it says the gifts of the spirit. And I found it was just an incredible enjoyment to sit and have dinner with people and have them tell their stories about Jacobson's. And I don't want to run over, but I'm going to tell a quick story about what happened here in Grosse Pointe one time. These ladies from Grosse Pointe that I met said we had in the good old days at Jacobson's, there was something called the 11 o'clock club. And those are the people that would go down and sit and have their lunch in the employee lunchroom at 11 o'clock. Because by noon, their best customers would come in. And she's, by best customers, I meant the Fords, the Dodges, the real wealth in Grosse Pointe. And she said, and these people were the top salespeople, and they were trained that there was nothing that they wouldn't do for these customers because they spend so much money and they're so important to the store. So one day, one of the sales girls gets a call from one of her customers. She was the favorite salesperson, and the customer said, and it was a lady in Grosse, I can't remember the name now, but she was an heiress to a fortune in seeds. So there was a seed company that was located here. Ferry Seed. Yeah. So Mrs. Ferry was invited to go to a flower show in Japan, and she called the salesperson up. She said, I've got to go to Japan, but I'm just not really into it. I don't feel like packing. I don't know. So could you do me a favor? And she said these people were trained never to say no to these people. So the sales girl said, well, yeah, sure, what was it? She said, could you go to the luggage department and give me a couple pieces of luggage for the trip? And she said, well, sure, I can do that. She says, well, then when you do that, could you stop in the lingerie department, have whatever I would need for 2 weeks, and how about some shoes and some cologne, and I need a coat, and I guess, whatever you think I'd need for 2 weeks. And the salesperson said, I guess, I know her sizes, I guess I can do that. And she said, well, then when that's done, do you think you could have it delivered out to the airport on Tuesday for me? And they said they had a runner at the store that could do that, and she said, yeah, we'll do that. So Mrs. Ferry was very pleased that they got the thing. They said, yeah, we have your luggage and everything. So she got on her flight to Japan. She got to the airport in Tokyo, and she's standing at the luggage carousel, and the luggage is going around. There's no luggage. She has no luggage. They lost the luggage. So she asked, what do I do? What am I going to do? And the somebody at the airport said, you have to go to the lost luggage office and file a claim. So she went in there. First question they asked her, what did your luggage look like? Oh, I don't know. What was in it? I don't know. So they finally had to call Jacobson's, and the sales girl at Jacobson's read down, she kept all the receipts in her personal trade book and was able to read everything back down to her. So that was truly Jacobson's customer service, what these people all, in my opinion, just epitomize. So very quickly, and I apologize that we can't see it all, I was able to rescue some photographs of Jacobson's from the archives there, scan them to put in this presentation. So this is a short little tour. That was the main store, shoe salon. These are all from when the store opened in 1974. The St. Clair Room, the men's store.
Now, originally, the St. Clair Room was upstairs,
Well,
here in Grosse
yeah,
Pointe.
and then, but it moved to the first floor
Right,
in the
right.
remodeling. Right. And then it was more like a cafeteria, I think, at the time when it was first opened. Again, the men's store, I think that's where my mom got my suit from.
That was originally
Miss J.
S. Stein Company that they bought.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, oozed into that.
Into that
area.
building, yeah.
Which was a men's store.
Yeah.
The men's store
Stein.
on the corner of Notre
no,
Dame, yeah.
Oh, Notre Dame
Yeah.
and
Churchill. Miss J shopped at shoes,
Oh my God, I remember
all
all
this
this
stuff, yeah.
stuff.
This would be coming right up the escalators to the
Oh,
second
yeah.
floor. And again, you can tell how spacious this is compared to the way you look at
Oh,
a
yeah.
store
It
nowadays.
was wonderful.
Children's wear,
Oh my God, I remember.
That was to the
now.
left
Oh
when
my
you got
gosh,
toy
going
department.
From that one, going to the stairs and down. Oh my gosh, yes.
that Lois Trost tells me that there was one of the, because this building was built from different buildings, there were ramps, and that the salespeople all referred to one of the ramps in there as Heartbreak Hill, because people would trip and fall down. Ladies' sportswear department. I think this was
Library
one
will
of
be
the
closed
higher
in
end
15
salons.
minutes.
They were also known for excellent displays, really elegant presentation of merchandise.
Yeah.
Now, this lady, her name was DeHaan, Miss Irene DeHaan, and she was famous because her husband was the first employee that Jacobson's hired as a janitor, and their house was behind the store. They eventually sold their property so they could build that parking garage, but she was known for gardening. And they won 4 times the state gardening awards at the Jacobson store there, based on her work. And she did all the maintenance work. After her husband died, he was older than her. She was born in Belgium. He was a Belgian immigrant. He went to Belgium. Somebody said, I got an orphan daughter or something like that. And she went and got her, brought her back and married her. And she stayed with Jacobson till she was in her 80s. And when they rebuilt the store in 1974, they named the passageway between the parking deck and the store DeHaan Way after her, because she did all the landscaping and all that. And she was a fixture in the store. And her daughter said, well, everybody in the store knew when she would walk into Mr. Washer's office, who was the manager, and say, we have to get the geraniums now, that she was ready to plant the geraniums for the summer, and she'd say her thick Belgian accent. But what she told Nathan at the time when he congratulated her on calling that street that name, she said, please tell me that I can keep working. Don't make me stop working. And she was just such a worker then. But, so that was a little tour.
Very good.
This last picture is kind of just the epitome
Well,
of
Bruce is here to sign
Jacobson's.
books. I apologize, we're short on time. Thank you so much for working through all the...
Yeah, and I have to